welcome, ladies. I am really excited about today's interview with Dr. Jennifer Finlayson Fife. And what would you like me to call you as we're talking?
Sure, you can say Jennifer, no problem.
Okay,
it's a mouthful.
So I just want to tell you a little bit about her. She is a psychotherapist with a PhD in counseling and psychology from Boston College. She wrote her dissertation on LDS women and sexuality and has taught college level courses on human sexuality, and she currently has online courses and community-based courses for relationships and sexuality courses. She contributes to a lot of podcasts, LDS-themed blogs, magazines. She maintains a private practice in Chicago where she lives with her husband and her 3 children. So thank you, Jennifer, so much for agreeing to this interview. I know I have several women that are so excited. I've gotten several questions from them as they've listened to some podcasts that you passed to me and I passed to them. So
Great.
I'm excited to get their questions answered. And I love the work that you're doing. I feel like it is so pertinent and it's so needed. And I love how you talk about we need to be connected with our sexual part of us, our sexual being, to be a whole woman. And so we're going to talk about quite a bit of that today, but we're first going to kind of dive into a little bit on a relationship basis, on having a good relationship with our spouses. And so I'll just dive into some of these questions and then we'll let it take us where we're going.
Great.
So I found that a lot of times we assume that our husbands are a version of us, and that's how we tend to approach circumstances with our husbands. And that's one of the things that I work on with women, is helping them understand we speak totally 2 different languages. So I wanted to just ask you how you felt this shows up in couples that you work with, and what kind of influence this has on our assumptions as women that our men should react and act and do things the way we do them. Do you find that coming out?
I do, and I maybe think about it slightly differently than the way you're saying it, but I guess what I would say is we want for our spouses to be reflections of ourselves. And men want this also, because we want to think of ourselves as loving people and then do whatever is comfortable for us. And so because we want that, because most of us resist the growth that marriage is going to pressure upon us. So I think that growth is uncomfortable, and we resist it. We resist expanding our capacity to really love another person. I think we resist knowing another person because of the ways that it challenges us to be better people. So I think the love language idea is valuable because it helps us to recognize what we tend to do, what our spouse tends to want. But I think it's not really a true idea that we are well-intentioned and just missing each other. I think what it really is we want the other person to be like us so we don't have to stretch. And I think really what marriage in its best form does is it stretches us, and it helps us to be more capable of really caring for another person in all of their difference.
Yeah, I like that. I actually really like that concept. I believe that is so true. And when I listen to your talking about perfectionism podcast, a lot of that really resonated with me. And I love how you talk about the need to develop. That as humans, that's what we're here for, is to develop. And so in our marriage relationships, we should desire, right, to want to develop a stronger connection, which would mean understanding him, understanding her.
Yes, that's right.
That's awesome. So what's your opinion on couples that say, oh, this is as good as it's going to get, I'm just going to settle? What's the long-term consequences to that?
Well, I do think there's room for acceptance in a marriage of another person and kind of recognizing who they are and not resenting them for how they're different from you.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that when we just kind of throw up our hands and say it's never going to get better, oftentimes what we're doing is we're also letting ourselves off the hook. And we're doing it in the name of putting up with our annoying spouse. Okay, kind of we take a sort of self-righteous position, like I would be fully capable of a good marriage except for you. And we like that idea because it allows us to mask how we participate in a bad marriage. Now, I'm not saying everybody in an unhappy marriage is a equal participant in a bad marriage, but oftentimes we're doing things that sustain and in a sense, give our spouse the excuse to keep living in an indulgent or low-level way. We have a kind of, something you can think is, how do I make it easy for my spouse to do the things that they do that bother me?
Mhm.
Right? How do I make it easy for them to feel justified in it?
Mhm.
What are the things that I do that would be hard to live with?
Yeah.
Because it's, you can't control your partner as much as we might want to. We
Mhm.
can control ourselves, and most of us use the fact that we can't control our spouse or get them to be who we want them to be to not get a hold of ourselves. And I think that is indulgent on our part. And I think, when we promise to love someone in marriage, usually what we are actually saying is, I promise to love you as long as you love me first and love me better. And when you really promise to love someone, you're saying through thick and thin, through better and worse, I am going to really deal with my limitations to be a good friend to you, to really care about you, even when you're making me upset. And I'm not talking about being a doormat. I'm talking about really caring for someone, even when they're frustrating you, or doing the hard work of creating a good marriage. You can only control your half, but when you do control your half and you do function at a higher level, you do pressure your spouse to do similarly because they're no longer justified in their position.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, because I've heard this, and in all my studying, I've heard this several times, that it only takes one person to change a relationship around.
Yes, because you change the dynamic of it.
Okay.
It's Harriet Lerner writes a few books, The Art of, I'm sorry, no, she writes The Dance of Anger and The Dance of Intimacy. And this is very much the frame she talks in, which is that it takes two to dance. And so if you're not doing the old steps, if your spouse is going to keep dancing with you, they have to change their steps.
Okay. Oh, I like
Yeah.
that. And what was her name?
Harriet Lerner, Lerner, and she writes The Dance of Intimacy and The Dance of Anger.
Okay. Oh,
Both two excellent books.
oh, great. Those are great. So if you have a client and she's wanting to work on herself, but her husband has zero interest, what would you would encourage her to keep working on what she has control over?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Even for her own sake. I mean, I have these online courses,
Mhm.
and I have had a lot of people write and say to me, I bought these courses because I was so aware of how my spouse needed to change. Then I went through them, and all I could focus on was all the things that I was doing that I had been blind to. And that just starting to really confront themselves and deal with their own negative behaviors that often we have a hard time seeing ourselves accurately, actually. And so starting to face yourself and deal with it starts to change the marriage.
Mhm.
I was saying to a client this morning, I think you need to be kinder to your husband. She was saying, I need to do that because he needs that from me. And I said, he may need that from you, but more importantly, you need to do that for your sake.
Mhm.
Because you're not living up to your best self, you feel bad about yourself. And you owe it to yourself to live up to your own values, almost irrespective of the impact it has on your spouse.
Mhm.
Because that she was saying, I'm greedy. And
Mhm.
I was saying, you owe it to yourself to not live in a greedy way
Yeah.
because you don't think it's respect worthy.
Yeah. That would
Hmm.
certainly help with the guilt level that we as
Absolutely.
so good at caring.
Yes, right. And we as women carry a kind of guilt that is about, oh, I'm such a failure, I'm such a loser, I'm not, but it's not a kind of pro-social constructive guilt often. I think guilt is actually a virtue if it leads you to move into better action. If
Yes.
it's like, I feel bad about the fact that I'm taking advantage of my husband, or I'm not really choosing him wholeheartedly, then I would say, then you owe it to yourself to do differently in your marriage. That's a kind of guilt that pushes you forward and into higher functioning.
Mhm.
And so it's a virtue. But if you just like living in guilt and you get to feel like, oh, I'm just a failure, but you take a kind of perverse comfort in feeling like a failure, like many of us do, then there's no virtue in that guilt.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. I like how you've brought that together where guilt can be a positive thing if it's moving
Yes,
forward in a forward intention that's going to help you create a happier place for you, even if
right,
the weather isn't changing.
right.
You know? Yeah, I believe as women, we have a lot of power in our relationships,
Absolutely we do.
for good or bad.
Absolutely we do. Right. And that moral conscience is a great thing. Chronic self-flagellation is not.
Yes.
Right. So I'm talking about moral conscience drives you forward and drives you to do things. You know, the woman this morning was saying, I feel awkward telling my husband I love him. And I'm like, there are worse things than feeling awkward,
Mm,
right? Loving him and caring about him, living up to your own values is more important than how you feel in the moment.
yeah.
The feelings of peace with yourself come after the reaching into something that's unfamiliar to you.
Mhm. I like.
And a lot of us grow up in families where we learn to kind of be in a kind of self-hating position.
Mhm.
And so it's familiar, and pushing ourselves to function at a higher level feels awkward, but that's okay because that's what it takes to move into a way of relating to others differently and in a way that that gives us greater peace.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah, because even, in those moments that I know I've reacted wrong, I've done something, yeah, just acted totally off of my cuff, and
Hmm.
make myself go through that uncomfortableness.
Yes.
Saying, "Hon, I'm really sorry. I did not mean to come across that way." Then afterwards, that peace does come. Like, oh, that was.
Yes.
But if I don't go there, if I don't push myself there, then
Yes.
when resentments start to build, the anger builds. I go inside my
Yes.
box. Nothing good comes.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. uh, Somebody whose work I follow closely is Dr. David Schnarch, and one of the things he says is there's no peace without integrity.
Mm,
So we will resist it because it's uncomfortable. I don't want to apologize. I don't want to deal with my bad part in this. He had a bad part too, or whatever it is. But we're never at peace when we do that. And if we will take care of our part, at least we're at peace.
yes,
And
yes.
so, you owe it to yourself to stretch yourself towards what you believe is decent and fair and right in your marriage, in your relationships, because that's where you find self-respect.
Mhm. Yeah, so true. I like that a lot. The client I was working with this morning struggles with beating herself up and pushing her through that point, and
Mm,
this will be so helpful for her. So,
great.
in one of your podcasts, that the one that you talk about, oh, actually, no, this one was a different one. This is one where you talk about intimacy, and you had come out and did a seminar here in Utah somewhere, and realized how challenging it is for women to receive.
Yes.
And that's a big one that we work on.
Yes.
The comment you made a comment that really stuck out to me, that as women, we like the control as the giver,
Yes.
and that we are needed and necessary. And that's where we get our sense of self.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. And let me start by saying I don't actually think that's giving. And
Mm,
we're calling it giving when it's about managing our own sense of self in our relationships. We're managing our sense of self by trying to feel important, as you said, necessary, indispensable.
mhm,
And it kind of fosters our self-righteousness and our resentment at the same time. And it's a way of kind of keeping ourselves out of intimate contact with another person. So even though it looks good, and I think culturally, many of us have been inducted into that frame of that's what goodness is as a woman, as she gives and gives and gives and gives and never asks for anything. There's a kind of safety in it because it's low contact and it's self-important. And so it's, I really think a true giver and true receiver are reciprocal positions. You can't be good at one without being good at the other. Meaning there are a lot of people that are takers. That's not the same thing as being a receiver. Okay, a receiver is you actually take in the goodness, you acknowledge the goodness that's around you. It's about being willing to say that someone has a positive impact on you and letting them have a positive impact on you and letting them know that they have a positive impact. That for people feels very exposing and low control.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I do believe that some people won't receive because they like the control of not receiving. I also think some people don't like to receive because it means you have to expand your sense of self in order to receive. You have to tolerate feeling worthy of it. And I remember in my own marriage in the beginning years of it, knowing that I had married a really good person and knowing that he really did love me and wanting in some ways to see it, reduce it in a way, to kind of reduce what was there, because then I felt more in control of it. And I remember really recognizing it wasn't decent to do that. And that I had to open my heart up and kind of take in the goodness that was there and expand my sense of self as being worthy of it and really let him give to me, let him love me and to receive it and acknowledge it. And acknowledge the positive impact he had on my life, that it was both good for him and me. And the more deeply you receive, the more generous you are because you see the goodness that's being offered, not because you're entitled to it, but because someone is loving and kind enough to offer it. Even the universe, the beauty that's around us, to receive the beauty of nature, to receive the nurturing of food, to receive sleep, to receive all these good things in our life is, in a sense, to step out of entitlement and control and to let it impact us for good while acknowledging the positive. It doesn't mean we're dependent on meaning if my husband were to betray me or to die, heaven forbid, I could sustain my life. I don't need my husband in that sense, but he deeply blesses my life. And so it's a way of acknowledging you have a real impact on me, which is different than can I sustain myself if I had to? Yes, I could. But he deeply impacts me. And to let that be alive between us is fundamental to receiving.
I like that. And do you feel that for men, because men are, what I've studied, are they're natural protectors and providers. They want
Yes.
to provide for us.
Yes.
And when we aren't willing to receive from them,
Right.
that probably hits them deeper than we realize.
Yes, it does. One of the things my husband said to me one time is he said, I appreciate how deeply you receive from me. Right? Because it's the receiver and the received. Right? It's like to be received is a form of giving. Right? Because it's saying you matter. You bless my life. And my husband really does. And he gives me so much. So I think that, first of all, I think we've constructed men's sexuality often as being a negative thing. That men are sexual and they're the brutes and we have to put up with them. And if we put up with them, that makes us virtuous women. And I think it's really the wrong way to see sexuality for men and women. Men can be brutes, okay? Let's be clear that there are some men that exploit with their sexuality. But to have that be a starting paradigm is unfair, I think. I think we need to see men's sexual nature as a capacity to deeply bless a woman's life, as a way to deeply give.
Mm-hmm.
to give pleasure, to give nurturance to a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And not because he needs to be the provider because she's too weak. I think that's a paradigm when we put men up and women down that interferes with intimacy. And many of us do this in our marriage where the man's here and the woman's here. So I don't mean providing out of a place of lack or inequality, but
Mm-hmm.
the ability to bless,
Okay.
right? Like men and women that are happily married function as forces for good in the world in masculine and feminine ways,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a way of really being able to bless and to be able to receive that goodness is good for both parties.
Yeah. Do you feel like receiving a woman that's able to receive in a healthy way? Does that connect her to her feminine self, being a woman that embraces?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a way of feeling like I am worthy of this.
Mm-hmm.
And the beauty of my femininity, my female body, my that I'm worthy of being loved and blessed and given to.
Mm-hmm.
And when you'll receive deeply, your people worry about being selfish or taking to, you're less likely to take when you receive deeply. You live with a greater sense of abundance. You're more in a position to really offer goodness, right? We need each other in that sense. Human beings are wired up to really be in connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to be strong people, we're wired up to be in connection. We're also wired up to be true to ourselves. And so being the kind of people that can really give and receive deeply is a way of being both true to ourselves and true to one another.
Okay. And what does receiving look like to you? Can you give like a situation of a woman graciously receiving? Um,
Well, there's the non-sexual and there's the sexual. Maybe I'll say in both ways.
okay.
I mean, I think in the beginning of my marriage, one of the ways that I took safety, quote unquote, but not really safe, was to kind of take a position of entitlement. I'm entitled to being loved.
Mm.
And I never would say that because that would be so unfeminine. Okay.
Yes.
But I would carry an attitude of like, you're the man, you should accommodate me.
Mhm.
If I feel insecure or anxious, then I should prevail
Mhm.
because I'm the weaker one. But it's an entitled position, right?
Mhm.
And when I sort of started to grow up and wake up to what I was doing, I think to receive is to say, like, this person chooses to love me day after day after day. He doesn't have to love me. I
Mhm.
mean, he made a commitment at marriage, but it's not a prison cell.
Mhm.
He's making a choice every day to love me, and I'm grateful for it.
Mhm.
Not because I'm undeserving, but because I'm not entitled. You
Yeah.
see the difference. And
Yeah.
so when you can acknowledge with gratitude that someone loves you and chooses you, and it's because of their decency and their kindness, and not because you're unworthy that it's such an amazing thing, but because human beings don't have to love each other. Many people are in marriages where there's very little love. And so to be able to see that when the goodness that's around you, to take it for granted, to assume it should be given to you, is to snuff all the joy out of your life.
Yeah.
I've told this story a few times. I had a landlord when I was in grad school, when I was single, and I used to paint the interiors of houses to earn money for grad school. And so I painted the interior of her house. And so she talked to me a lot about her husband during that time. And she complained about him, and he's not this and he's not that. And he seemed like a good guy to me, frankly, but I didn't know a lot. Well, not long after that, he was an architect. He was presenting. In the middle of his presentation, he collapsed on the floor and died.
Mhm.
And because I'd become friends with her, I was then privy to the grieving that she went through. And she had so much grief about the fact she appreciated everything he'd offered her life that now she was glaringly aware of,
Mhm.
now that it wasn't there. And she was grieving for how she had not thanked him or lived with more gratitude and let that gratitude bless their marriage. And so it was a way of getting from him without receiving. Many of us get and take without receiving.
Yeah.
And so she would say to me, I'd do anything to go back and to thank him. Because what happened is she didn't let there be any abundance between them. It was like taking hostages was the kind of marriage she was creating with him. and saying everything he gave was, she'd take it, but it was still too little, rather than appreciating what her life would be like if it weren't there. And that's one way we can increase our gratitude is, what would I lose if this person weren't here? He doesn't have to love me.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to give to me.
Yeah.
So he does give to me. And that doesn't preclude us from running our life or from dealing with the things that aren't happening in the marriage. In fact, I think the more we acknowledge the goodness that's there, the more able we are to deal with what we want to change and do better at. So I think that, there's a way of receiving what goodness is there in the form of where you are ungrateful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, sexually, I think you have to see yourself as deserving. I think you have to let go of the control. I think you have to tolerate letting someone really know you and experience you to really receive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you may also, in receiving, recognize you may be partnered with somebody who's not very generous. So some of us are partnered with a spouse that's very generous, but we don't want to acknowledge that to them. And we know that we are. Others of us, in some ways, would rather be in the kind of guilt, non-receiving, in some ways as a way of masking from ourselves that we are not partnered with someone who's generous. Mm-hmm. Right? And so sometimes we are afraid to confront what our marriage is, whether it's good or not so good. But I think that many women have husbands who do want to give to them sexually, and there are many ways to receive through even a husband bringing his wife to orgasm, for example, takes time, takes investment on the husband's part, and it requires a willingness to receive. Right? And instead of disparaging yourself in this whole frame that I'm taking too long, well, the thing is, women's sexuality is different than men's sexuality. And it does take time for a woman to become aroused. And if you just won't receive that and you're going to disparage it, you're never going to have the kind of sexual experience that you're capable of, because you're making his reference point as the reference point rather than seeing yourself as a legitimate sexual partner, even if different.
Okay.
In fact, sexuality that works well in couples is more female-centric. And we come from a male-centric paradigm that culturally, and you have to work against that idea if you're really going to both have satisfying sex. It has to become more female-centric, and willingly and happily so. This is, if men like to give, let them really truly know who their wife is and know what her sexuality desires, not just what theirs desires. And let the woman be willing to make room for her sexuality rather than just accommodating her husband and then thinking she's the good one because she's putting up with him.
Yeah, that has a lot of thoughts going on in my head right now, like how, men want to provide, women are giver, so we have to teach her to be willing to receive, and how that receiving from him, I mean, I know in my particular relationship, for my husband, he's more concerned during intimacy that I am taken care of than even himself.
Yes.
So I can only imagine how frustrating that would be for him if I wasn't willing to receive that. Absolutely.
So there are a lot of husbands I work with who really, really want for their spouse to have a positive experience, but she kind of won't have it. And so then there's, they can't give really because she won't receive. Yeah.
So in order for, you mentioned in this other podcast that in order for women to be a whole self, they need to be integrated with their sexuality. What does that look like to a woman? If she, struggles with being integrated with her sexuality, what does that even look like? How do you walk a woman through, how to discover that for herself?
Well, I think a sort of starting point is that many of us have grown up learning that sexuality is a threat to goodness, and particularly so for women, that it's a threat to femininity, sexual desire. I mean, we take as a given that women are sexual in that men are interested in them sexually, but somehow that sexual desire in a woman is a threat to her femininity or her goodness. And so many women learn to kind of disown or be at least at arm's length with their sensual, erotic selves. And I think the reality is that if you had to say who is more sexual by nature between men and women, I would say it's actually women. Women are erotic, emotional, earthy creatures. We really are. I mean, that's our sort of most natural state, is to be deeply connected to the emotive, sensual, earthy part of ourselves. But I think because we're afraid of the power that's in it, and we want to keep ourselves non-threatening and likable, many of us, we think, being considered desirable or not a threat is our most important goal if we're going to be in a relationship with a man. Many of us learn that idea. So we disown our sexuality as a way to make ourselves desirable. And this is, in my way of thinking, I believe, God gave us our bodies as a gift, as a source of wisdom and joy. And so if we disconnect from this source of wisdom and strength, we really, we undermine our ability to really function as equals. We undermine our ability to access this source of joy and wisdom in our lives.
Yeah.
And our sexual nature is only a threat in two conditions, is if we use our sexuality to do ill in the world. Okay, if we use it to exploit other people or do harm, or to be so self-focused somehow that you are damaging, okay? But we can even do that through sexual repression, not just sexual indulgence, okay? Because you can do a lot of harm in a marriage by never dealing with your sexuality. The other way, the second thing I was going to say, is you can see it as harming your relationships if you believe a man has to feel like a man by you being weak. So many of us think, oh, a man has to feel strong, therefore I have to be weak. Or he needs to feel good about his sexuality, and my sexuality could be a threat. And real strength doesn't need weakness in other people. Only pseudo strength needs weakness in other people. Real strength begets strength in others because it can handle others being strong. And I'm not talking about bulldozers. I mean, like being at peace and at ease with yourself and being able to be a force for goodness in the world. You don't need somebody to just slide underneath you emotionally or sexually if you're really a strong man. If you're really a strong man, you can love a whole woman in all of her sexuality, and you can even let her sexuality eclipse yours without feeling threatened.
Yeah.
Because I think women's sexual capacity is greater than men's, in that women have a higher capacity for, meaning men can get aroused and orgasm much more quickly than women. And if you're having 10-minute sex, men look like they're the sexual champs, okay? But if you're doing it on a scale in which women's sexuality thrives, then women take longer to get aroused, and they're pickier about when they're going to be open sexually. So they're pickier about the context.
Yeah.
But once they decide it's a good context and they get aroused, which takes longer, then the depth of orgasm, the emotionality and I would say it surpasses. And then women are capable of being orgasmic multiple times. So they're working in a different trajectory and depth. But if you're focused on men's satisfaction, you don't see women's capacity.
Okay.
Right.
Well, and that was actually a question that came in from one of my ladies. She had heard that you said that women have the capability, let me make sure I word this correctly, the capability of having a deeper, greater capacity, like you said, for pleasure than men. And she wanted to know, is this because we have a deeper emotional element to intimacy that heightens our pleasure, or are you referring to physical capacity?
Mostly physical capacity, but also perhaps this emotive part of ourselves, that we can feel it deeply when we really allow it in ourselves. But we have the physical capability of deeper sexual physical response. But again, it's that different trajectory. And if you're focused on men, then you look like the broken one.
Yeah. So what do you encourage or say to women who struggle to orgasm, if that's not something that's been?
Yep. I would say when we think of it as a way of proving that we're not defective, you're going to have a very hard time orgasming.
Okay.
If you see it as a way of receiving
Mm-hmm.
and expanding your sense of self, and see it as a way of really giving to yourself and letting yourself actually be integrated with your body and belong to yourself more deeply, you're going to find more permission to experience it.
Okay.
But many of us are trying to orgasm as a way of like making our husband feel successful. It's not going to happen that way, because it's not about belonging to ourselves and really allowing ourselves to be at peace with and accepting of our body and our sexual capacity.
Okay. So do you think there's a connection between women that might struggle with this and their ability to be fully open, be fully?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely a connection, and a desire for control.
Okay. Okay. And it could be just at a total subconscious level, something they're not even really aware of.
Yes. And what I would also say is there's some women who are with a spouse that they feel judged by, criticized by, or they feel inferior to, even if the husband is not functioning in that way to pressure them down. But if you feel one down, you're going to feel slower about wanting to really, truly open yourself up to let your sexuality and your eroticism be seen and experienced if you don't feel like you're really a peer. So some of us are hiding it because we don't want the other one to experience it. It's also can be a way of withholding from the other person. Also, if you're afraid, if you do orgasm, now they feel like now you have no more excuses for having limited sexual contact. So there can be a lot of reasons why we'll underfunction in a way to keep control, but we rob ourselves of our strength.
Yeah, because we really are meant, I mean, God gave us the ability to, he gave us the gift of sex.
Absolutely.
He made us to have that, and it's not just to make babies.
Absolutely. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Like for, for men, the phallus is responsible for reproduction and waste elimination. Okay. But for women, the clitoris is only responsible for pleasure. Okay. So if God didn't want you to have pleasure, we would not have a clitoris. Exactly. It's a very explicit. And some people think, oh, the clitoris is this little tiny, mini penis, but it's like really small and insignificant, just like women. Okay. But the clitoris is this vast neural network. It has more nerve endings than the penis does. The opening of the labia is the equivalent of the shaft of the penis. Okay, so that is to say, the way we were developed, you have just as much sexual capacity. Now, men's sexual capacity looks different, and it's easier to find and experience because their sexual organs are more overt and women's are more covert. But they are equal in capacity, if not women's superior.
Yeah. Okay. I really, I like that link, how you said, and I want my clients to understand it could be at a subconscious level. We don't realize what we may be having hesitations about that are keeping us from having that full experience of intimacy.
Right. And we think of it often as a biological problem in those moments.
Yeah.
But our psychology and the meaning that we bring to ourselves and our bodies and our sexuality deeply determine what we experience, even how touch is experienced, because we're processing it through a meaning frame. And if your mind is tracking, I don't feel safe to be sexual here, even if the thinking about it is wrong, if you don't feel like safe, or you've constructed a reality in which you can't or shouldn't be sexual, you're not going to be sexual. I mean, you're not, your body knows. The body knows.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure it's been made that way for the purpose of women not being taken advantage of, women being able to protect themselves in a mental state.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. And I think, and then I think we can get accustomed to where we're comfortable, even if we're miserable, and not push ourselves into our strength.
Yeah.
And my work is very much about helping women and men be truly strong people,
Mhm.
not the kind where you do dominance and submission in some form psychologically, but where you really are living into the strength that in part is accessed through real integration with your body and your values.
Mhm. Well, I know you speak very strongly about women aren't sent here to service their husbands.
Yeah, definitely.
That not no good is going to come from us feeling like we are just here to service them, take care of their needs.
We
Um,
will resent them and never love them if we see them that if we believe that's our relationship to men.
yeah, yeah,
Who wants to be the slave of any man for life?
yes,
Right? It just doesn't work. I mean, to say that we can bless one another, that's different.
hmm,
But that's that we are equals who have a capacity to enrich one another's lives if we can really bring our best selves to each other.
hmm. And do you feel like traditions of our fathers from,
Yeah,
obviously we've heard all these different comments, don't ever enjoy it, don't ever be too,
yeah.
don't, all these things that have influenced.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. We have come by this honestly.
Mhm,
Just as men have come by a kind of superior or entitled position honestly, or anxiety about their sexuality as being a force for ill. I mean, men feel like they're sexual because that's what they've been socialized into, but that they can do harm to a woman. So many men have a lot of ambivalence about their desire,
mhm,
right? And so we've come by these false traditions honestly, but if we cleave to them too much, they undermine our ability to have the true joy through meaningful intimate sexuality that we are capable of having. And many people talk about that being transcendent, about really it's an access to the kind of a deep source of joy and anchoring in their lives that gives them strength to really cope with the imperfection that's around them throughout the rest of their day.
yeah. Well, and that's what I find is when a couple is doing well in the intimacy department sexually, it really sets a tone for
Oh,
how the
yeah,
marriage is running.
absolutely. It deeply impacts how happy people are in a marriage. And we diminish sex and desire as if it's like the stepchild of love. But in marriage, they really, if anything, love is the stepchild of desire. Now, I know that sounds to some people like, what? This isn't this selfish? But see, what I would say is that sex is, by nature of what it is, a sexual contract. It's the idea that I choose you and you choose me. Choice is at the core of marriage. It's the non-biological love relationship. And so and so because it's non-biological, it's about choice, and it's saying I choose you to bring my sexuality to you, for us to have an exclusive sexual relationship. And so if you're going to be loving, you need to treat that sexual relationship with care. How do we make it a good sexual relationship? How do we love each other through our sexuality? And so creating a meaningful sexual relationship is part of the fiber, the fabric of that relationship, of the core of it. You chose that person to marry because they desired you. They love you, they care for you, right? But the kind of deep anchoring is in that sense of I choose you and you choose me. It's at its core a romantic paradigm. And so if you don't keep that paradigm alive, and you diminish it as somehow being ungodly, right?
Mhm,
Which many of us do once we get married,
mhm,
then I think we deeply undermine our marriages. We
mhm.
just do. And so I'm often working with couples around, what's going on in your emotional relationship deeply will affect your sexual relationship and vice versa. They impact each other, but not to neglect it.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like it's such a vital part, and it's a shame that we don't talk about it more and prepare
Yeah.
girls,
Yes.
especially more,
Yes.
when they're younger and growing up and not being ashamed of their bodies. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
it makes it all
Right.
more um, important, the work that you're doing. I just think it's so vital that we get the word out there And, I had my daughter's actually been taking one of my courses it's a live online course, and I'm having her in part of the group. And after the sex one, week 8, I always know I'm going to have follow-up phone calls, ladies, I'll talk to.
Sure.
And I called my daughter just to make sure she was okay.
Mm-hmm.
She goes, I'm mad. I'm angry. I'm really
Mm-hmm.
angry, Mom. I'm angry that my whole life I was taught it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. And all of a sudden it's good. And now I'm messed up in my head a little bit.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
embrace that this is good. And
I know.
really,
Many women talk about this, that it's just that there's no integration premaritally. And it's very hard to create an intimate sexual relationship if you haven't on any level integrated your sexual nature as a good part of being a woman, a good part of being alive, and something that you can share. We do it in the servicing frame. Like my sexuality exists to keep his sexuality under control. Like not good sex, okay?
yeah,
Where no, I am a sexual being by my birthright. It's fundamental to being a woman. It it is good in the sense that God gave it to me. And what I can be confident in its goodness is that knowing that how I use it will create goodness in my life and in this relationship.
yes,
So, but so many of us don't have that. And so my dissertation research was interviewing women who had grown up LDS or active currently, and that transition into marriage. And for many women, it was a very hard transition. In some, there was a loss of a sense of self, that they'd gone from feeling sort of virginal and pure to now kind of losing something rather than an expansion of self through through sexuality. And many like feeling like now I have to service my husband for eternity. And it immediately starts creating resentment, the feeling of invasion, because there's no sense of like identity with their sexual selves or their desires. And it's a very hard thing that our false traditions have created for our daughters, but for our sons also.
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I think it does go both ways in them
Yes,
being taught, because I think a lot of times men people assume men just know.
absolutely. And the idea that men should always be on top of it, and that they're kind of, and that it's not linked to intimacy for them,
Mhm.
right? That it's not linked to being known. And I think in some ways, because we give it so much cultural legitimacy, that men can sort of claim it in a different way on some level. But I think we rob the personhood of men through their sexuality. Um, very much so, like that men feel like they have to be sort of sexual performers can create a lot of anxiety for men, and an inability to actually show up intimately also.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. Um, I had one other question from one of my ladies who said, you talk very confidently in one of your podcasts on our sexual relationship, not just his. And
Yes.
that obviously that's the issue of women not being able to be good receivers and
Mm-hmm.
understanding, having a connection with their sexual selves. She says, how do you counsel women to overcome the guilt of receiving or the embarrassment of feeling equal in the realm of intimacy? We've kind of been
Well,
discussing that a little
yeah,
bit.
absolutely. So what she's saying is, how do you overcome the anxiety of moving out of the culturally sanctioned one down position and the maritally um, customary position of being one down sexually or otherwise, and really kind of take your space as a full partner?
Mhm.
Because you have to kind of believe in the legitimacy of yourself and your sexuality to take a position that's not getting a lot of cultural validation. Like many of the women say to me, what does it even look like when a woman is comfortable with her sexuality? They don't even have a picture in their mind. They have either the harlot or the restricted, asexual woman.
Mhm.
And so, I think that it means being able to create a picture that I know I deserve this, that I'm not going to keep standing down in order to keep equilibrium or to live down to the false traditions that I've been offered. I believe in that this is wrong, and that I deserve to really take an equal space, and that my femaleness and my sexuality are not inferior or need to be hidden. So it's a way of validating yourself
Mhm.
and believing in a God who is happy for you to do that,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And believing that God wants you to live out to the full of your potential, and that your strength is not going to diminish your husband's strength
Mhm.
or his sexuality unless he needs you to be small so he can feel pretend big.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Not healthy.
That's not helping, and it's not healthy. It's like propping up immaturity in somebody, and it only breeds resentment in you.
Yeah.
And so if you don't want to resent your husband, you need to live up to your strength. So how do you do it? It's daring to occupy that space, even though your brain's saying, no, you're not supposed to be here, you're supposed to feel ashamed. Go back to how we know how to do things. And
Mhm.
it's really easy to do that, but development is always about pushing yourself into territory that feels uncomfortable and tolerating the discomfort while reaching for what you know is right or better.
Mhm.
That's what faith is.
Yeah.
And it's when you do that that your brain can organize around a new understanding and self-understanding, and you get clear and more confident. And when I look at my own life, I used to occupy one down all the time. I mean, it was just like the way I lived. And it was really through pushing myself to see myself as an equal, even though I didn't feel like it or I didn't think other people thought of me that way, and really believing in a God that wanted me to do that and believed in me, gave me the strength to push myself towards being a stronger, more confident, more comfortable self so that I could move out of apology and into my strength.
Yeah.
So, and I'm so grateful that I did that for myself, because you start seeing the world more clearly, you start seeing yourself more clearly, and you're able to really be a person capable of intimacy and of really loving, rather than staying in a kind of one down dependency that taxes you, taxes your spouse, and taxes your children when they watch you do it.
Mhm. Well, and I just really feel that intimacy, sexuality is a gift given to us. Life is a challenge. It's hard raising family.
Right.
You're busy. It's hard trying to make it a living. I almost feel like Heavenly Father's like, this is a reprieve for you
Mm-hmm.
from the world. And
Absolutely.
you're meant to feel excitement, joy, fun, closeness.
Yes.
It's not, I often have had conversations where it's supposed to be all just it's very beautiful and
No,
no, I'm like,
no,
I
no.
haven't
That's
experienced
boring.
that,
I
but
right.
so your
Absolutely.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a form of grown up play, and being able to play together in this way is very intimate. And
Mhm.
there are times when you're just going to be in that, I love you, I'm so grateful for you, I just want to look at you kind of sex. Certainly, that can be a wonderful part of marriage, but to somehow require that it must always be only that, that it isn't a way of playing and sharing your silliness, which our erotic minds are quirky and weird. And to be able to accept that part of ourselves, I think, is part of self acceptance and the capacity for intimacy.
Yeah.
So, absolutely. Um, I also would say, when we're babies, we get to be fully enjoyed in all of our bodies. We're kissed and hugged and stroked, and every roll of fat is adored. And all you had to do is bang your spoon and throw food, and your parents would swoon. Like there's no, you
Yes.
get full acceptance, right, of the whole body. And then as you get older, there's more privacy, there's more expectations, you get covered up. Then you go into adolescence and your sexuality starts emerging, and you feel strange and weird and isolated. And so what we all desire is that kind of acceptance again. I mean, I think that's why we wax poetic about our first kiss, is that's that movement from isolation into acceptance and connection again. And it's what we want in our marriages, to be accepted all the way through, to be loved and cuddled and kissed and touched and desired in the way we were as young children. And so when we can create the kind of friendship and self-acceptance in which that can happen, we do ourselves a great favor.
Mhm. Yeah. It's a whole nother part of life if you haven't been able to experience that's just going to open up for you. And
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. It's like, yeah, I think it's the best part of life. If you're
Mhm.
able to create that in your marriage, you're one of the lucky few because it's such a rich source of freedom
Mhm.
and joy that I think we all long for, but often will sabotage in our own marriages because we're afraid of actually having it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, yeah, we need to learn how to receive, girls, and we need to learn that we're worthy of it. And it's a gift that's been given to us as well. We're no less than
Def-
them, than our spouse, than our husbands, as far as sexuality is concerned. So
Definitely.
yeah, I love that. So you probably agree then, those marriages that are doing really well, they're going to have a level of a healthy sexual relationship.
Yes. And in my dissertation research, it wasn't really what I was expecting to find or see, but they also had a real sense of equality between them. Even if they said, oh, the husband's the leader of the home, even if they cleave to some of those ideals, in reality, they were very equal in decision making, in economic decision making. Like they really were collaborators and they really functioned like psychologically as equals. And that was really striking for me to see that. And I think that's just really important for us to claim our place there.
Yeah. Oh,
God needs our strength. We throw it away when we step down.
hmm, for sure. That's awesome. Well, Jennifer, how do these ladies find out about your courses? And I know you do seminars all over
Yeah,
the place. How do they find out this information?
sure. And maybe you can link to it so it's easier. But on my website, which is my name, finlaysonfife.com. So I have podcasts, some of them you referenced. So there's like a link there that can put you in touch with a lot of the podcasts I've done on perfectionism and lots of other topics. And then there's also a workshop. I have online courses tab that I teach several courses on into both how to have a better relationship in your marriage, how to have a better sexual relationship in your marriage, and then of course on women's relationship to desire, both sexually and non-sexually, which is a lot of what we're talking about today, which is how to belong to ourselves more profoundly and to our sexuality. um, and so I also do some workshops, and so what you also, there's a tab there for events and workshops that I do in 2-day workshops that I offer to women on these topics around their sexuality and desire. They're currently sold out, all the ones that I have going, but I'll probably be offering some more in the next month or so. So
Okay, that will be
yeah,
awesome. That will be great. Such valuable information for these ladies. Thank you so much. You've enlightened me. I'm looking forward to sharing this with all my ladies, and they'll have that ability to have that same enlightening. And I'm just hoping that by all the people that you communicate with, one by one, we're just going to change the paradigm of our youth
yes,
and how we teach this. And
yes. We
so,
need to change it because, I think living up to our, what I, as an LDS woman myself, I talk a lot about living up to the best in our theology because it's all there for us, but we've often looked at it from a lens that limits us, and it's all there for us to see ourselves as strong co-creators of goodness.
mhm,
And we need to do that in our sexuality and in our marriages for the sake of all of us.
mhm,
So yeah,
yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you
thank you.
so much for joining me. I appreciate it. And I hope to someday make it to one of your seminars.
Yeah,
That
that'd be
would be
fun.
fantastic. I would love it. So
That
I
would be great.
appreciate taking the time. I know you're super busy, so taking the time to do this really meant a lot to us. So
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.